The day my son's wife decided to organize my junk and threw my photo collection in the trash, she unknowingly disposed of evidence of a career that had made me one of the most sought-after celebrity photographers of the 1960s and 70s. My name is Betty, and at 79 years old, I had accumulated what most people would consider a lifetime of clutter. Boxes of photographs stacked in my spare bedroom, filing cabinets full of contact sheets and negatives, and albums that my daughter-in-law Sandra viewed as nothing more than dusty reminders of a past that was taking up valuable space in what she considered an increasingly unmanageable household. "Mom, we need to talk about this hoarding situation," Sandra announced, as she surveyed my home office, with the expression of someone who had appointed herself to solve problems that I didn't consider problems. "You can't keep every piece of paper and every photograph you've ever owned. It's not healthy, and it's making the house impossible to navigate." Sandra had married my son Michael 5 years earlier, and from the beginning she had made it clear that she considered my lifestyle choices to be evidence of an elderly woman who was losing her ability to make rational decisions about possessions, organization, and appropriate boundaries between past and present. "These aren't just random papers, Sandra. These are my work archives." "Mom, you worked as a secretary 40 years ago. How much archive material could there possibly be from answering phones and filing documents?" "A secretary, that's what my family had always believed about my career, because that's what I had allowed them to believe." It was easier than explaining the truth about why I traveled constantly, why I worked unusual hours, why I knew celebrities personally, and why I had more money than a secretary's salary should have provided. The truth was that I had never been a secretary. I had been a professional photographer specializing in intimate, candid shots of musicians, actors, and cultural figures during the most dynamic decades of American entertainment history. I had worked under the professional name, Chen, building a reputation for capturing celebrities in unguarded moments that revealed their humanity rather than their public personas. But I had kept that career secret from my family for reasons that had seemed important at the time, and had become impossible to explain as the years passed. "Sandra, those boxes contain irreplaceable photographs and documents that represent decades of work." "Work doing what? Exactly?" "Mom, I've looked through some of these boxes, and it's just random pictures of people I don't recognize, mixed with a bunch of old papers that don't make any sense."
Random pictures of people she didn't recognize.
If Sandra had bothered to look more carefully, she might have noticed that those random people included some of the most famous musicians, actors, and cultural figures of the past 50 years. If she had examined the documents more closely, she might have seen contracts with major magazines, payment records from entertainment companies, and correspondence with galleries that had been trying to acquire my work for museum exhibitions. "Sandra, I'd prefer to organize these materials myself. They have more value than you realize." "Mom, that's exactly the problem. You think everything has value when most of it is just junk that's preventing you from living in a clean, organized space." Sandra had already made up her mind that my photograph collection was evidence of hoarding behavior rather than a carefully maintained archive of professional work. In her mind, helping me declutter was an act of love and practical support for an aging woman who could no longer distinguish between valuable keepsakes and meaningless accumulation. "I've scheduled a donation pickup for tomorrow," Sandra continued. "We'll keep a few of the best family photos in proper albums, and the rest can go to charity where they might bring joy to people who don't have any family pictures." Donation pickup. She was planning to give away my life's work to strangers who would have no understanding of what they were receiving. "Sandra, please don't do that. Let me go through everything first, and decide what should be kept and what can be disposed of." "Mom, that's exactly what we've been trying to avoid. Every time we ask you to organize something, you want to keep everything because you can't make decisions about letting go of the past." Can't make decisions. As if my desire to preserve my professional archive was evidence of mental decline rather than reasonable protection of valuable assets. But here's what Sandra didn't understand about the photographs she was planning to donate, or throw away. Here's the information that would have changed her approach to my junk if she had bothered to research what she was handling. The boxes she considered worthless clutter contained original photographs that I had taken of the Beatles during their 1965 American tour, including candid shots of the band members that had never been published and existed nowhere else in the world. They contained intimate portraits of Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, and Neil Young that I had shot during recording sessions in the early 1970s, when these artists were creating the albums that would define a generation. They contained behind-the-scenes photographs from movie sets, where I had been hired to document the filming process, including images of legendary actors like Paul Newman, Elizabeth Taylor, and Marlon Brando in unguarded moments between takes. They contained fashion shoots I had done for major magazines, featuring models and clothing designs that had become iconic images in fashion history. Most importantly, they contained signed releases and legal documentation proving that I owned the rights to these images and could sell them to collectors, museums, or auction houses, for prices that would have shocked Sandra if she had any understanding of the art photography market. "Mom, I'm doing this because I love you. Living surrounded by all this clutter isn't good for your mental health or your safety. What if there's an emergency and paramedics can't navigate through all these boxes?" Love. Sandra's version of love involved disposing of my professional legacy without consulting me about its value or significance. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Sandra moving boxes from my home office to the front porch, preparing them for the donation pickup that she had scheduled without my consent. "Sandra, please, stop. I need to go through those boxes before they leave the house." "Mom, we discussed this yesterday. It's time to let go of the past and focus on living safely in the present." Let go of the past. As if my career as a photographer was just nostalgia rather than documented history that belonged in museums and private collections. I watched helplessly as Sandra loaded decades of my work into her car, planning to take everything to a donation center, where my photographs would be sold for pennies to people who would have no idea what they were buying. But here's what Sandra didn't know about my morning activities. Here's what she had missed while she was busy organizing my junk into garbage bags and donation boxes. I had called my longtime friend and business manager Harrison Wells, who had been trying to convince me for years to allow a major auction house to sell my photograph collection. Harrison had estimated that my complete archive could sell for between $8 and $12 million, depending on market conditions and the level of interest from collectors and museums. "Betty, please tell me Sandra didn't actually throw away your photographs," Harrison said when I explained what was happening. "She's loading them into her car right now to take them to Goodwill." "Jesus Christ, Betty. Do you have any idea what she's about to give away?" I did have an idea, but Sandra didn't. And my son Michael, who had supported Sandra's decision to help me organize, had no understanding of what his wife was destroying in the name of helping his mother live more safely. "Harrison, what can we do to stop this?" "Call the police if you have to, Betty. What Sandra is doing is disposing of property that doesn't belong to her, and that has enormous financial and cultural value. But calling the police would mean revealing the truth about my career to my family, exposing the decades of secrecy that had seemed necessary to protect my work and my relationships." The question was whether preserving my family's ignorance about my professional success was worth sacrificing the irreplaceable documentation of American cultural history that Sandra was about to donate to strangers for a tax deduction. The answer became clear when I saw Sandra loading the box containing my Beatles photographs into her car, treating them like unwanted junk that was cluttering up her mother-in-law's life. It was time to tell the truth about who I really was and what she was throwing away. The phone call I made to stop Sandra from donating my photographs was the call that would change everything my family thought they knew about my life, my career, and my financial situation. "Harrison, I need you to come to my house immediately with documentation proving the value of my photograph collection. And bring a security guard if you think it's necessary to prevent theft of valuable property." "Betty, are you sure you want to take this step? Once your family knows about your career and the value of your work, you can't go back to the quiet retirement story you've been telling them." Harrison was right. For 20 years since my official retirement, I had allowed my family to believe that I was living on a modest pension and Social Security benefits, maintaining a comfortable but unremarkable lifestyle that didn't require explanation or justification. The truth was that I had continued earning substantial income from licensing my photographs to magazines, book publishers, documentary filmmakers, and commercial clients who wanted to use my images of famous cultural figures. My archive was not just a collection of personal memories, it was an active business asset that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in royalty payments. But maintaining that secret had required me to live below my means, to hide evidence of my ongoing professional relationships, and to accept my family's assumptions about my limited resources and diminished relevance. "Harrison, Sandra is about to give away millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable photographs to Goodwill. I can't let that happen, even if it means revealing everything I've kept private about my career. 30 minutes later, Harrison arrived at my house, accompanied by 2 assistants, and carrying a briefcase full of documentation about my photograph collection, insurance appraisals, auction house evaluations, and correspondence from museums that had been trying to acquire specific images for their permanent collections. Sandra was in my driveway, loading the last boxes into her car when Harrison's black sedan pulled up behind her. "Excuse me," Harrison said, as he approached Sandra with the authoritative demeanor of someone who was accustomed to handling valuable property. "I'm Harrison Wells, Mrs. Chen's business manager. I understand you're planning to dispose of her photograph collection." "Her photograph collection?" Sandra looked puzzled. "These are just old family pictures and random snapshots that are cluttering up her house. I'm donating them to charity." "Ma'am, I need you to stop what you're doing immediately. Those boxes contain professional photographs with an estimated market value of $8 to $12 million. The silence that followed was the silence of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. "What did you just say?" Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out appraisal documents, insurance policies, and auction house correspondence that detailed the value and significance of my work. "Mrs. Chen is one of the most respected celebrity photographers of the 1960s and 70s. Her archive contains original photographs of the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Elizabeth Taylor, and dozens of other cultural figures. These images are not family snapshots, they're museum-quality documentation of American entertainment history." Sandra stared at the official documents as if they were written in a foreign language. But she worked as a secretary. She never said anything about being a photographer." "Ma'am, your mother-in-law worked under the professional name B. Chen. Her photographs have been featured in Rolling Stone, Vogue, Life magazine, and major museum exhibitions around the world."
B.
Chen, a name that Sandra might have recognized if she had paid attention to photography credits in the magazines she read, or if she had bothered to research the signature that appeared on many of the photographs she had been planning to donate. My son Michael arrived at that moment, having received Sandra's panicked phone call about the strange man who was claiming his mother was a famous photographer. "Mom, what's going on? Sandra says someone is trying to stop her from cleaning out your spare bedroom." Michael had inherited Sandra's assumptions about my career and my financial situation. To him, I was a retired secretary who lived modestly on fixed income and occasionally needed help managing the practicalities of aging. "Michael, I need to tell you some things about my work and my life that I've never discussed with the family." I invited everyone into my living room where Harrison could present the documentation that would reveal the scope and significance of the career I had kept secret for decades. "Your mother," Harrison began, "has been one of my most successful clients for over 30 years. Her photograph licensing business generates approximately $400,000 annually in passive income from magazines, book publishers, and commercial clients who want to use her images. $400,000 annually. More than Michael earned in his job as a middle school principal, more than Sandra earned in her part-time work as a real estate agent. But that's just the ongoing income," Harrison continued. "The complete archive has an estimated value of $8 to $12 million if sold as a collection to a museum or private collector." Michael was staring at me as if he had never seen me before in his life. "Mom, are you actually a famous photographer?" "I was a professional photographer for 30 years, Michael. I specialized in celebrity portraiture and behind-the-scenes documentation of the entertainment industry. But you never said, we never knew. I chose to keep my career private because I wanted to protect my family from the attention and complications that come with public recognition, and because I wanted to enjoy retirement without constantly being asked to discuss my work or sell my photographs." Sandra was still holding the appraisal documents, reading estimated values that ranged from $50,000 to $200,000 for individual photographs that she had been planning to donate, alongside used clothing and household items. "Mrs. Chen, this document says you have original photographs of the Beatles that are worth $600,000. That's a conservative estimate based on recent auction prices for similar images. If my Beatles photographs were sold individually at auction, they could bring substantially more. And these Bob Dylan photographs are valued at $400,000? Those were taken during recording sessions for Blood on the Tracks. They're the only candid shots that exist from those sessions, and Dylan has never released them for publication." Sandra was going through the appraisal documents methodically, discovering that nearly every photograph she had dismissed as worthless clutter was actually a valuable asset that collectors and museums had been trying to acquire. "Mom," Michael said, "if your photographs are worth millions of dollars, why are you living like you're on a tight budget? Why do you clip coupons and drive a 15-year-old car?" "Because I don't need an expensive lifestyle to be happy, Michael. And because I've been saving money to leave a substantial inheritance for you and Sandra and the grandchildren." That was the moment when Sandra realized the magnitude of what she had almost done. Not just disposing of valuable property, but destroying the financial legacy that I had been building for my family's future. "Betty," Harrison said, "I need to ask directly, do you want to proceed with selling the collection? The Museum of Modern Art has been waiting for your decision about their acquisition proposal." The Museum of Modern Art, one of the most prestigious art institutions in the world, had been trying to buy my photographs for their permanent collection, offering prices that would establish my work as culturally and historically significant. "What kind of proposal?" Michael asked. "MoMA wants to acquire the complete collection for $9.5 million and establish a permanent exhibition called Intimate Icons, the celebrity photography of B. Chen." Sandra sat down heavily on my sofa, processing the information that she had been minutes away from donating a museum-quality art collection to charity. "Mom, we had no idea. We thought you were just a woman with too many old photographs who needed help organizing." "Sandra, I understand why you made that assumption. But this is exactly why I've been hesitant to involve family members in decisions about my work and my assets." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your love for me led you to make decisions about my property without understanding its value or significance. You assumed that because the photographs looked old and unfamiliar to you, they must be worthless clutter rather than valuable professional work. That was the lesson I had been afraid to teach my family directly, that their assumptions about aging, memory, and the relevance of past accomplishments could lead them to destroy things that had enormous value and meaning. But now that the truth was revealed, I had to decide whether to sell my collection to MoMA or to continue maintaining it as a private archive that would provide ongoing income and eventually pass to my family as inheritance. The decision would determine not just my financial future, but my family's understanding of who I really was and what I had accomplished during the decades when they thought I was just answering phones and filing documents. The meeting with the Museum of Modern Art's acquisition team took place in my living room 3 days later, with Michael and Sandra present to witness negotiations that would determine the fate of my life's work and establish the value of a career they had never known existed. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, MoMA's chief curator of photography, spread portfolio samples across my coffee table with the reverence of someone handling sacred artifacts. "Mrs. Chen, your work represents one of the most comprehensive documentations of American cultural transformation during the 1960s and 70s. These photographs didn't just capture famous people, they captured the moments when American entertainment culture was being redefined." Sandra leaned forward to examine the portfolio images, seeing for the first time the quality and significance of the photographs she had been planning to donate to Goodwill just days earlier. "This photograph of the Beatles backstage at Shea Stadium," Dr. Morrison continued, "shows the band members in a completely unguarded moment. Paul McCartney is reading fan mail, John Lennon is tuning his guitar, and you can see the exhaustion and vulnerability behind their public personas. I took that shot 15 minutes before they went on stage," I explained. "They had no idea I was photographing them. They were just 4 young men dealing with the pressure of performing for 50,000 screaming fans." In this series of Bob Dylan in the recording studio, these are the only photographs that exist of Dylan working on some of his most important songs. The intimacy and spontaneity you captured is unprecedented in music photography. Michael was studying the Dylan photographs with fascination. "Mom, how did you get access to document these recording sessions?" "I had developed relationships with record producers, managers, and the artists themselves. They trusted me to photograph them without exploiting their privacy or sensationalizing their personal moments. That trust had been the foundation of my career success. The ability to be present during intimate, creative moments without becoming intrusive or disruptive to the artistic process." "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Morrison said, "MoMA's acquisition committee has authorized me to offer you $9.5 million for your complete archive, including negatives, contact sheets, and reproduction rights." $9.5 million. The number hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything my family thought they understood about my financial situation, and my place in cultural history. The acquisition would also include a major retrospective exhibition featuring 150 of your most significant photographs, accompanied by a comprehensive catalog that would establish your work in the context of American art and cultural documentation. A major retrospective at one of the world's most prestigious museums. Recognition that would position my work alongside the greatest photographers in American history. Dr. Morrison, Sandra asked, what would happen to the photographs if Mrs. Chen decides not to sell to the museum? That's really Mrs. Chen's decision to make. But I can tell you that private collectors have been trying to acquire individual photographs from her archive for decades. If she chose to sell through auction houses, the collection could potentially bring even more money, though it would be dispersed rather than preserved as a complete archive. Dispersed rather than preserved. The photographs could generate more income if sold individually, but they would lose their power as a comprehensive documentation of an era in American culture. There's also the question of legacy, Dr. Morrison added. A museum acquisition ensures that Mrs. Chen's work will be preserved, exhibited, and studied by future generations. Private sales often mean that photographs disappear into collections where they may never be seen by the public again. Legacy. The word that focused my decision-making on questions that went beyond immediate financial return. Dr. Morrison, if I sold to MoMA, what would happen to the ongoing licensing income from my photographs? The museum would take over licensing rights, but you would continue to receive royalty payments for any commercial use of your images. The licensing income stream would continue, but would be managed professionally by the museum's commercial rights department. Michael had been quiet throughout the negotiation, processing the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Finally, he asked the question that addressed the heart of the family dynamics that had brought us to this moment. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us about your career? Why did you let us think you were just a retired secretary who needed our help organizing your belongings? The question I had been dreading and preparing to answer for 20 years. Michael, I wanted to protect you and Sandra from the complications that come with public recognition. I wanted to enjoy retirement without constantly being asked to discuss my work or make decisions about selling photographs. But we could have understood, we could have supported your work instead of treating it like junk that needed to be thrown away. Could you have understood, Michael? Sandra was ready to donate millions of dollars worth of museum-quality photographs to charity because she assumed that anything old and unfamiliar must be worthless clutter. Sandra looked embarrassed but also defensive. Betty, I was trying to help you live more safely. I thought those photographs were just hoarding behavior. Sandra, that's exactly the point. You made assumptions about the value and significance of my work, based on your perceptions of aging and appropriate lifestyle choices for elderly women. The truth was that I had kept my career secret, partly to avoid exactly this kind of situation, family members making decisions about my property and my life, based on stereotypes about what elderly women should own, how they should live, and what their past accomplishments might be worth. Dr. Morrison, I said, I need to think about your offer. Can I have a week to make my decision? Of course, Mrs. Chen, but I should mention that if you decide not to sell to MoMA, there are several other major museums that have expressed interest in acquiring your work. After Dr. Morrison left, I sat with Michael and Sandra, surrounded by the documentation of a career they had never known existed, processing the implications of revelations that had changed our family relationships permanently. Mom, Michael said, I owe you an enormous apology. We had no idea what we almost destroyed. Michael, you made assumptions based on limited information, but those assumptions could have resulted in the loss of irreplaceable cultural artifacts. So what happens now? Are you going to sell to the museum? I'm going to make a decision that honors both the historical significance of my work and the financial security of my family. But the real decision I needed to make wasn't about museums or money. It was about whether to continue hiding my accomplishments from family members who had proven they might not recognize their value, or whether to risk full disclosure of a success that might change our relationships in ways I couldn't predict. The choice would determine not just the fate of my photographs, but the future of family dynamics that had been built on incomplete information about who I really was and what I had achieved during the decades when they thought I was living a quiet, unremarkable retirement. The family dinner I organized the following Sunday was different from any meal we had ever shared. Instead of gathering around Michael and Sandra's dining table for casual conversation about work and grandchildren's activities, I invited everyone to my house, where I could show them the complete scope of the career I had kept hidden for 20 years. My daughter Lisa had driven in from Portland after Michael called to tell her about the museum offer and the revelation about my photography career. My grandchildren, Emma and Jake, sat wide-eyed as I pulled out albums and portfolios they had never been allowed to examine closely. "Grandma Betty," Emma said, looking at a contact sheet of photographs I had taken of Joni Mitchell. "These are incredible. You really took pictures of all these famous people?" "I did, sweetheart. For 30 years I photographed musicians, actors, and cultural figures during some of the most creative periods of their careers." Jake, who was studying art in college, was examining my photographs with professional interest. "Grandma, these aren't just celebrity snapshots. These are serious artistic portraits. The composition, the lighting, the intimate access. This is museum-quality work." Museum-quality work. From a 20-year-old who understood photography better than the adults who had been ready to throw my life's work in the garbage. "Jake, your grandmother has been offered $9.5 million by the Museum of Modern Art for her complete collection," Sandra said, still processing the magnitude of what she had almost destroyed. "Holy shit," Jake whispered, then immediately looked embarrassed for swearing at the dinner table. "It's okay, Jake," I said. That was my reaction too when I first understood what my photographs were worth to collectors and museums. Lisa had been quiet throughout dinner, studying the portfolio samples I had spread across the table. Finally, she asked the question that addressed the heart of our family's confusion about my career and my secrecy. "Mom, I don't understand why you kept this from us. Why did you let us think you were just a retired secretary when you were actually this accomplished artist?" "Lisa, I kept my career private because I wanted to protect my work and my family from the complications that come with public recognition." "What kind of complications?" "Complications like having family members make assumptions about what I should do with my photographs, how I should live my retirement, and what decisions would be best for my financial security." I looked around the table at the family members who had spent years worrying about my limited income, my modest lifestyle, and my resistance to their suggestions about financial planning and lifestyle changes. "For 20 years, you've all treated me like a woman with limited resources who needed guidance and protection. You've made assumptions about my capabilities, my financial security, and my decision-making abilities based on your perceptions of appropriate retirement lifestyles." "But Mom," Michael said, "we were trying to help. We didn't know you were financially secure." "Michael, would you have treated me differently if you had known about my career and my income?" Michael considered the question carefully. "Probably, yes. We would have trusted your judgment more and been less concerned about your financial decisions." "So your level of respect for my autonomy was based on your assumptions about my financial resources rather than your recognition of my right to make decisions about my own life." The silence that followed was the silence of people recognizing an uncomfortable truth about their own attitudes toward aging, independence, and family relationships. "Mom," Lisa said, "we made mistakes. But we made them because we love you and want to make sure you're safe and secure." "Lisa, love that includes the assumption that aging means diminished judgment, and the need for family management isn't the kind of love that honors autonomy and dignity." Sandra had been quiet throughout this conversation, clearly processing the implications of her actions and attitudes. Finally, she asked the question that would determine whether our family could move forward with greater understanding and respect. "Betty, what do you want from us going forward? How can we support your decisions without making assumptions about your capabilities?" "Sandra, I want you to ask questions instead of making assumptions. I want you to consult me about decisions that affect my property and my life. And I want you to recognize that my choices about lifestyle and possessions might be based on values and priorities that you don't fully understand." "And the photographs? What are you going to decide about the museum offer?" I pulled out the decision I had reached after a week of consideration, not just about the financial implications, but about the legacy I wanted to leave and the lessons I wanted to teach my family about respecting the accomplishments of aging adults. "I'm going to accept MoMA's offer with one modification. I'm going to donate half of the proceeds to establish a foundation that supports aging artists and documents the contributions of elderly people who are often overlooked by society." "And the other half?" Michael asked. "The other half will be divided among my children and grandchildren, with the understanding that this money represents the value of work that you dismissed as worthless clutter just days ago." Emma raised her hand like she was in school. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Are there other things about your life that we don't know? Other secrets that might surprise us?" Emma's question was perceptive and important. She was asking whether my photography career was the only aspect of my life that I had kept hidden from family members who made assumptions about elderly women's relevance and accomplishments. Emma, there are probably many things about my life, my relationships and my experiences that the family has never asked about or shown interest in learning.
Like what?
Like my friendships with the celebrities I photographed, my ongoing involvement in art and culture, my political activities, my volunteer work, and my continued learning and growth as a person. The truth was that my family had seen me primarily as a grandmother and retiree, whose most interesting days were behind her, rather than as a complete person with ongoing interests, relationships, and accomplishments. Emma, here's what I want you to remember from this experience. Never assume that older adults are less capable, less interesting, or less accomplished than they appear. Always ask questions about people's lives, their work, and their experiences instead of making assumptions based on age or lifestyle choices. And never throw away anyone's photographs without asking what they mean, Jake added with a grin. Especially never throw away anyone's photographs without asking what they mean. As dinner concluded and family members prepared to leave, carrying portfolio samples and documentation that proved their grandmother was not just a retired secretary, but an accomplished artist whose work would be preserved in one of the world's most prestigious museums, I realized that our family dynamics had shifted permanently. They would never again see me as simply an elderly woman who needed their guidance and protection. They would never again make assumptions about my financial resources or my decision-making capabilities. They would never again dismiss my possessions as worthless clutter without understanding their significance and value. But most importantly, they had learned a lesson about the assumptions society makes about aging, and the importance of respecting the autonomy and dignity of elderly adults whose lives might be far more complex and accomplished than their families realize. The photographs Sandra had tried to throw away had become the foundation for rebuilding family relationships based on respect rather than assumptions, recognition rather than dismissal, and curiosity rather than presumption about the hidden depths of people whose most interesting chapters might still be unwritten. 6 months later, I stood in the Museum of Modern Art, surrounded by 150 of my most significant photographs, displayed in a major retrospective exhibition that had transformed me from a family secret into a publicly recognized artist whose work was being celebrated by critics and visitors from around the world. Intimate Icons, the celebrity photography of Bi Chen, had opened to reviews that described my work as unprecedented documentation of American cultural transformation, and portraits that reveal the humanity behind the mythology of fame. Michael and Sandra stood beside me, reading wall text that described my career achievements and the historical significance of photographs they had been ready to donate to charity just months earlier. "Mom," Michael said, looking at my portrait of Elizabeth Taylor taken during the filming of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, "seeing your work displayed like this makes me realize how completely we misunderstood who you are and what you've accomplished." The Elizabeth Taylor photograph was one of my personal favorites, a candid shot that captured the actress in a moment of vulnerability between takes, her famous beauty shadowed by exhaustion and the pressure of performance. This photograph, Sandra read from the wall text, exemplifies Chen's ability to reveal the private person within the public persona, documenting not just celebrity, but humanity. Sandra had spent the past months educating herself about photography, art history, and the market for celebrity portraiture, trying to understand the significance of the work she had almost destroyed. "Betty, I still can't believe I was going to throw this away," she said, standing in front of my series of Bob Dylan photographs. "These are incredible historical documents." The Dylan series had become one of the most discussed aspects of the exhibition, featuring intimate shots of the songwriter, working on lyrics, interacting with musicians, and capturing the creative process behind some of the most influential songs in American music history. Dr. Morrison approached us as we toured the exhibition, carrying a folder of press clippings and visitor feedback that had exceeded all expectations for public response to my work. "Mrs. Chen, the exhibition has been one of our most successful photography retrospectives ever. We've had over 50,000 visitors in the first month, and the critical response has been overwhelming." "What kind of response?" I asked. "Critics are calling your work essential documentation of American cultural history and portraiture that transcends celebrity to reveal universal human experience. The New York Times said your photographs capture the moments when fame becomes art and art becomes immortal." The New York Times. When I had started my photography career in the 1960s, a review in the Times had been the ultimate validation of artistic achievement. But perhaps more importantly, Dr. Morrison continued, your exhibition has sparked conversations about the hidden contributions of women artists and the assumptions society makes about aging and relevance. What do you mean? Visitors are asking how many other accomplished artists might be living quietly among us, dismissed by families and society as unremarkable elderly people whose most interesting days are behind them. That conversation was exactly what I had hoped to generate by revealing my career and allowing my work to be exhibited publicly. Emma and Jake arrived from college, bringing friends who were studying art and photography, and wanted to meet their famous grandmother, Grandma Betty. Emma said, my art history professor says your exhibition is changing how museums think about discovering and recognizing artists whose work has been hidden or overlooked. How so, sweetheart? She says Mama is starting a program to identify other elderly artists who might have significant bodies of work that their families don't recognize or value. Other elderly artists whose accomplishments might be dismissed as hoarding, whose professional archives might be considered worthless clutter, whose life's work might be donated to charity by family members who couldn't recognize its significance. That's wonderful, Emma. The idea that my experience could help other artists avoid having their work dismissed or destroyed is more meaningful to me than any individual recognition. Jake was standing in front of my Beatles photographs, surrounded by a group of visitors who were discussing the historical significance of the images. Mrs. Chen, one of the visitors said, approaching me with the respectful demeanor of someone meeting a celebrity. These Beatles photographs are extraordinary. How did you gain such intimate access to document them? I built relationships based on trust and professional respect. The artists I photographed knew that I was documenting their creative process, not exploiting their fame for sensational purposes. And you kept these photographs private for 50 years. I kept them private until I was ready to share them in a context that would honor both the artists and the historical moments they represent. What I didn't mention was that I had also kept them private to protect my family from the complications of public recognition, and to avoid the assumptions people make about elderly women's relevance and capabilities. But the exhibition had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It had transformed my family's understanding, not just of my individual accomplishments, but of the hidden potential that might exist in other aging adults, whose stories had never been fully told or recognized. Mom, Lisa said, joining our group with a newspaper review of the exhibition, this critic says your work challenges assumptions about aging and artistic relevance by proving that some of our most important cultural documentation has been hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain sight. That phrase captured exactly what I had experienced. Living as an accomplished artist while being treated by my family as a woman whose most significant contributions were in the past. Dr. Morrison pulled me aside to discuss something that would extend the impact of my exhibition beyond the museum walls. Mrs. Chen, we've been contacted by several documentary filmmakers who want to create a film about your career and the story of how your family discovered your work. Are you interested in participating in that kind of project? A documentary film that would tell the complete story, not just of my photography career, but of the family dynamics that had led to my work nearly being thrown away, and the broader social issues about aging, recognition, and the hidden accomplishments of elderly adults. What would be the focus of the documentary? The filmmakers want to explore how society overlooks the continuing contributions of aging adults, how families make assumptions about elderly relatives' capabilities and possessions, and how your story illustrates the importance of asking questions instead of making assumptions. And they want to interview Sandra about her experience? They want to interview your entire family about the lessons learned from almost disposing of museum-quality artwork, and about how the experience changed their attitudes toward aging and autonomy. I looked across the gallery at Sandra, who was explaining to visitors how she had almost donated the photographs they were admiring to charity, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding the value and significance of elderly people's possessions before making decisions about disposal or donation. Sandra had become an unexpected advocate for recognizing the hidden accomplishments of aging adults, speaking at senior centers and family education programs about the importance of consulting elderly relatives about their possessions and their histories. Dr. Morrison, I think a documentary could be valuable if it helps other families avoid the mistakes my family made, and if it encourages society to recognize the continuing potential and past accomplishments of elderly adults. The filmmakers are particularly interested in the broader implications of your story. How many other accomplished artists, professionals and innovators might be living quietly among us, dismissed as unremarkable elderly people whose families don't recognize their significance? That question had been haunting me since the exhibition opened. How many other photographers, writers, artists, inventors, and cultural contributors were living in families that saw them only as aging relatives, who needed help organizing their junk rather than as accomplished individuals whose life's work might have enormous value and significance? As the evening reception concluded and visitors began leaving the gallery, I found myself standing alone in front of my portrait of Joni Mitchell, a photograph I had taken in 1971 that captured the songwriter in a moment of creative intensity that had never been seen by the public until this exhibition. Michael approached me with an expression that combined pride, regret, and something that looked like deeper understanding of the woman he had thought he knew completely. "Mom, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me since we discovered your career." "What is it, Michael?" "Are there other elderly people in our community, our neighbors, people at the senior center, relatives we rarely see, who might have accomplished things we don't know about, who might have stories and achievements that we've never bothered to learn about?" Michael's question revealed exactly the kind of awareness I had hoped to generate through my exhibition and my story. "Michael, I guarantee there are accomplished, interesting, and significant people all around us, whose families and communities have never asked the right questions about their lives, their work, and their contributions. So what should we do differently? Ask questions instead of making assumptions. Show interest in elderly adults' complete life stories, not just their current needs and limitations. And recognize that someone's most interesting and accomplished years might not be behind them. They might be happening right now, hidden in plain sight." As we prepared to leave the museum, where my life's work was being celebrated and preserved for future generations, I realized that the photographs Sandra had tried to throw away had accomplished something far more important than individual artistic recognition. They had started a conversation about the hidden potential that exists in aging adults, whose accomplishments might be dismissed, whose possessions might be considered worthless clutter, and whose stories might never be told because their families and society assume that their most significant contributions are in the past. The exhibition would run for 6 months, but the lessons about recognizing and respecting the continuing relevance of elderly adults would last much longer. 1 year after the MoMA exhibition, I was sitting in my home office, the same room where Sandra had once planned to dispose of my worthless clutter, reading letters from families around the world who had discovered hidden accomplishments, valuable possessions, and untold stories among their elderly relatives after learning about my experience. The documentary about my story, titled Hidden in Plain Sight, The Beach End Discovery, had aired on PBS and streaming platforms, generating thousands of responses from viewers who had been inspired to ask different questions about the elderly adults in their own lives. "Dear Mrs. Chen," read one letter from a woman in Ohio, "after watching your documentary, I asked my 82-year-old father about his career before retirement. I discovered that he had been a research scientist who contributed to several important medical breakthroughs, but had never discussed his work because he thought we wouldn't be interested in technical stuff. We're now working with his former colleagues to document his contributions to medical history." Another letter came from a family in California. "Our grandmother had boxes of what we thought were old sewing patterns taking up space in her attic. After seeing your story, we looked more carefully and discovered that she had been a fashion designer who created costumes for major Hollywood films in the 1950s. The patterns were original designs that costume museums want to acquire for their collections." Each letter represented a family that had moved beyond assumptions about elderly relatives' possessions and accomplishments to discover hidden histories that enriched their understanding of the people they thought they knew completely. The phone rang, interrupting my reading. The caller was Dr. Sarah Martinez from the National Aging Institute, who had been developing programs based on the lessons learned from my family's experience. "Mrs. Chen, I'm calling with exciting news about the Hidden Accomplishments Project that your story inspired." The Hidden Accomplishments Project was a nationwide initiative to identify and document the undiscovered contributions of aging adults whose achievements might be overlooked by families and society. "What kind of news, Dr. Martinez?" "We've identified over 300 elderly adults whose families have discovered significant accomplishments, valuable collections, or important historical documentation after learning about your experience and asking different questions about their relatives' lives. 300 families who had moved beyond assumptions about aging and irrelevance to discover that their elderly relatives had fascinating, accomplished, and valuable histories that had been hidden in plain sight. What kinds of discoveries? We found retired engineers whose inventions are still used in major industries, former teachers whose educational materials are being studied by university researchers, artists whose work has been sitting unrecognized in closets and basements, musicians who recorded with famous bands but never mentioned their professional careers to their families. And families are taking these discoveries seriously? More than that, families are learning to approach aging relatives with curiosity and respect, rather than assumptions about decline and irrelevance. Your story has changed how people think about the hidden potential that might exist in elderly adults, whose most interesting chapters might still be unwritten. Emma knocked on my office door, carrying her laptop and wearing the excited expression of someone who had discovered something important. "Grandma Betty, you need to see this. I've been researching other photographers from your era, and I found something incredible." Emma had spent her college years studying art history and photography, inspired by the discovery of my career, to explore the contributions of other women artists who might have been overlooked or forgotten by art history. "What did you find, sweetheart?" "I found evidence that there are at least 12 other women photographers from the 1960s and 70s, whose work was as significant as yours, but who never received recognition because they worked under pseudonyms, kept their careers private, or had their work attributed to male colleagues. 12 other women photographers whose accomplishments might have been dismissed as hobby snapshots by families who didn't understand the significance of what they were looking at." Emma, that's exactly what I hoped would come from sharing my story, the recognition that there are accomplished people everywhere whose contributions have been overlooked. "Grandma, I want to write my senior thesis about hidden women artists and how families and society can better recognize and preserve their work." "That's a perfect project, Emma. And when you're finished with your research, maybe you can help other families avoid the mistakes we almost made." Sandra arrived for our weekly coffee visit, carrying a folder of materials from her new volunteer work with senior advocacy organizations. "Betty, I wanted to show you something from the Senior Center where I've been doing presentations about recognizing elderly accomplishments." Sandra had transformed her embarrassment about almost throwing away my photographs into advocacy work that helped other families avoid similar mistakes. "Last week, I spoke to a group of adult children about how to approach their parents' possessions and stories with curiosity instead of assumptions. Afterward, a woman approached me to say that she had discovered that her mother had been a NASA mathematician whose calculations contributed to the moon landing, but the family had never known because she had worked under security classifications that prevented her from discussing her career. A NASA mathematician whose family had never known about her contributions to space exploration because she couldn't talk about classified work and they had never asked the right questions about her career. "Sandra, that's exactly the kind of discovery I hoped would result from sharing our experience. Betty, I need to tell you something. Working on this project has taught me more about respecting elderly adults than anything I learned in 45 years of life. I understand now that my assumptions about your possessions and your lifestyle were based on stereotypes about aging rather than genuine understanding of your choices and your accomplishments. Sandra, the important thing is that you learned from the experience and used that learning to help other families approach aging with greater respect and curiosity. But I almost destroyed irreplaceable cultural artifacts because I assumed that anything old and unfamiliar must be worthless clutter. Sandra, you made a mistake that thousands of families make every year. The difference is that your mistake led to education that will help prevent other families from making similar mistakes." As Sandra left and I returned to reading letters from families who had discovered hidden accomplishments among their elderly relatives, I realized that the photographs she had tried to throw away had accomplished something far more significant than preserving my individual artistic legacy. They had started a movement that was changing how society approaches aging, recognition, and the hidden potential that might exist in elderly adults whose stories have never been fully told. Tommy Henderson, now a successful elder law attorney, called to update me on legal cases where he had helped families recover valuable possessions that had been disposed of by relatives who didn't understand their significance. "Mrs. Chen, your story has become required reading in law schools that teach elder advocacy. Students learn about the importance of investigating the value and significance of elderly clients' possessions before allowing family members to make disposal decisions. How many cases have you handled where families discovered valuable items after disposal?" "Dozens. Families who threw away coin collections worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, book collections that included first editions, artwork that turned out to be originals by famous artists, and business documents that proved ownership of valuable intellectual property. And families are becoming more careful about these decisions. Your story has made families much more aware that elderly relatives might have valuable possessions, important accomplishments, and fascinating histories that require investigation, rather than assumption. The moral of this story? Never assume that what looks like junk to you might not be treasure to someone else, or to history, or to the world. Never make decisions about other people's possessions without understanding their significance and value. And never underestimate the hidden accomplishments of elderly adults, whose most interesting and valuable contributions might be sitting unrecognized in boxes that families consider worthless clutter. That's how photographs thrown in the garbage became a museum exhibition that changed how society thinks about aging, recognition, and respect. That's how a family's assumptions about worthless clutter became a movement to discover and preserve the hidden accomplishments of elderly adults whose stories deserve to be told. Life has a way of revealing that the people we overlook might be the most accomplished people we know, if only we bothered to ask the right questions and look beyond our assumptions about what aging means and what elderly adults might have achieved during the decades when we thought they were living quiet, unremarkable lives. I have more stories about hidden accomplishments, overlooked achievements, and the importance of approaching aging adults with curiosity instead of assumptions about decline and irrelevance. Stories about families who learned to see their elderly relatives as complete, accomplished people whose most significant contributions might be sitting unrecognized in closets, attics, and spare bedrooms. So pull up a chair, maybe ask an elderly person in your life about their career, their accomplishments, and their stories, and remember that the most valuable treasures might be the ones that look like junk until someone takes the time to understand what they're really looking at. Because we're only just getting started, and you won't want to miss what comes next.